When I say alien, you're probably going to think of one of three things. A gray-green humanoid that has a really big head and bulbous eyes, something from H.R. Geiger's Nightmares.
It's a penis!
Or fantasies. Or the little dudes from Toy Story.
I've been chosen. Farewell, my friends.
We've seen riffs on these designs time and time again, and it can feel like sci-fi is just a repeat of yesteryear's monsters. And it kind of is, but that is not what this video is about. Surely, with all of the time and money pumped into the big old media machine, we'd have some more unique alien designs come out over the years. Well, there is one tucked away in this 2014 box office flop. It didn't flop at the box office? Well, that's news to me because no one seems to have watched it, but I guess you can only fail so hard if your lead is Tom Cruise.
I do this to avoid doing that.
Edge of Tomorrow has refreshing alien designs that aren't just visually innovative, they're also a really key part of the story that means that these aliens can't just be copy-pasted into any other sci-fi flick. But first, a quick plot summary because I only watched it a couple of weeks ago and most of my friends don't seem to have watched it, so I feel like there's a pretty good chance that you haven't seen it either. Tom Cruise plays Major William Cage, a media military guy that is a bit of a coward, but has been ordered to go cover the alien invasion from the front lines. He tries to blackmail his way out of it, but that just gets him arrested, demoted, and sent off to the battle bus anyway. From there, he's slapped into an exosuit with zero training and dropped off on Normandy Beach to fight for his life. By sheer luck, he does manage to kill a blue glowy alien, covering him in claymore shrapnel and alien guts, which ends his life in a rather gruesome way. But then he wakes up on the battle bus again. Turns out the blue alien guts is time loop juice, which allows him to live this day over
The only thing I can feel in my lips.
and over and over again until he basically becomes a super soldier by just doing too many ranked games and kills the alien hive mind. Skipping over a ton of details here, but you get the gist of it. Through that first battle, the viewers really drag through the mud along with Cage. We're meant to be as disoriented and confused as he is. There's shrapnel and debris everywhere, there's aircraft and soldiers getting downed left and right, there's so much going on, it is so overwhelming, and that's all by design. Even when we encounter our first alien, we don't really get enough time or information to really grasp what we're looking at. Only when we come across the first alpha, we get to see a full, wide shot that gives us enough time and information to process the creature that we're looking at. So what are they? Well, the mimics are made up of a central head, and that's the only consistent part. The rest of the creature is a blob of obsidian tentacles that reshape themselves with seemingly no particular pattern. This incomprehensible, unpredictable nature of the design makes it hard for the audience to really get a grasp on what we're looking at. So that's the first design element we're going to look at. The fact that mimics have no consistent shape or silhouette is what makes them confusing, scary, and interesting. For those of you that aren't familiar, let me explain the character design philosophy of silhouettes. If you take a character, or alien in this case, and flatten the image to all black, you're only left with this shape, a silhouette. To create a distinctive character, you want your silhouette to be unique enough that your viewer can look at it with no color, no textures, no sound, no nothing, and be able to identify what they're looking at. A great example of great character silhouettes would be two hero shooters, Overwatch and Team Fortress 2. In both of these games, characters have such a distinct silhouette that makes it very easy to read at a glance. So even if they're on the other side of the map, or you just see them for a couple of frames, usually you can identify what character you're looking at, even if you don't have all of the information. On the flip side, the team behind Edge of Tomorrow went in the opposite direction, intentionally. If you flatten the image of a mimic to just all black, it's kinda hard to see what it is. But there's two other design choices that really make it come to life. The team could have just left mimics as a massive tendrils with no head, a bunch of obsidian limbs slashing about blindly. That would be incomprehensible and horrifying, but not quite in the way that they wanted. They found that when it came to animation tests with just the tendrils with no core, it seemed like it didn't have a real direction. It was too random. So they added the head. In typical sci-fi fashion, the heads of the mimics take inspiration from more reptilian and insectoid sources. They're made up of rocky scales, and their faces are very aggressively angular. You can see this all across sci-fi. The most fearsome aliens usually take inspiration from things humans don't like. Snakes, spiders, phallic objects, that sort of thing. If they wanted to make the mimics more empathetic, then they would have used humanoid or mammalian features that tend to be softer and more welcoming. Like a little buddy tapioca over here. The last design choice that really makes the mimics so incomprehensible is the way that they move. Now, we have a creature here with a central head and tentacles, so it's easy to start imagining it moving like a squid or an octopus. That's too familiar to most audiences to be scary and incomprehensible, so it kinda undermines the other design choices. So when it came to animating the mimics, the team had to make sure that the creatures move in such a way that doesn't resemble our tentacled aquatic friends that we're already familiar with. This is where the animation process comes in, using a special technique called procedural animation. In traditional 3D animation, you typically have three basic elements: your 3D model, your skeleton, and your rig. Your 3D model is the actual polygons that make up the shape of whatever you're creating. Usually the sculptor puts it in an A or T pose, which makes it easier to rig. Then we go over to the skeleton, which acts like a skeleton, believe it or not, where you basically group parts of the 3D model mesh to each bone, so then when you move the bone around, the mesh follows with it. And then you have your rig, which is basically a bunch of like control handles to move the skeleton in ways that make sense with limitations, like how your arm and your knee have limitations to how far those joints can move. With all that set up, then you either animate it with keyframes, which is the old school way of doing it, or use motion capture data, which doesn't always work when it's not so humanoid. But I can already hear you saying, if the mimic doesn't have a consistent body or shape, how would you animate it with traditional methods? Very good question, dear viewer. You are smart and paying attention. Good on you. So this is where procedural animation comes in. Instead of using your traditional keyframes or motion capture data, you would give your software a bunch of rules and parameters to do the animation for you, basically. This is more typical in video games, where having creatures dynamically move around an environment means that sometimes letting the computer do all the math is the better solution. Take Rainworld, for example, where the game takes your input, say moving left over this ledge, and the computer figures out how to animate your character to match that movement in a way that matches the rules that the developer has set out. It's basically the same thing for the mimics in Edge of Tomorrow. While it's not real time, the animators would animate the head and the movement that they wanted it to generally follow, and then the computer, based on that movement and the rules set out in the software, would animate the tendrils to follow along. This allows the mimics to retain that style of movement that's kind of like a slinky on crack, except the animators don't have to spend weeks and weeks animating each tendril by hand. The computer does all the heavy lifting. But to really sell the believability of the mimics, we need some finishing touches. With their violently fast movement, it would be very easy for mimics to fall into that category of CGI monsters that don't really feel like they're part of the world. To make the audience believe that these aliens are really there on the beach killing thousands of soldiers, we've got to make it look and feel like they're really there. I'm gonna play a couple of clips here, and I just want you to take close note of what the mimics sound like, and then I'll explain. To make the mimics really seem real, they've got to interact with the environment in a way that really is believable. That means kicking up debris, the sound of grinding rocks as they move, metal scraping on metal as they reshape their tendrils. Details like this that most audience members aren't going to notice, but if they were absent, people would definitely complain. Okay, so this is a cool and unique alien design, but why did I say that I don't think it can be copy-pasted into just another sci-fi movie? Well, the dynamic and incomprehensible design of the mimics is not only just a unique alien design, it's also a functional part of the story too. The United Defense Force has been fighting the Mimics for 5 years at the point that the movie starts, and yet they have zero information on these aliens. The issue is that the soldiers that make it to the battlefield and get a grasp of what Mimics are like are also the soldiers that die. The only way that humanity makes any progress against these incomprehensible creatures is by accidentally getting 2 soldiers in a time loop. That blue glowy alien that Cage kills at the start, that's an alpha, and it has a direct connection to the hive mind of all these aliens. And it turns out the Mimics are so unsolvable because they've fought this war 1,000 times. As soon as humanity makes the tiniest bit of progress, it just resets back to the start of the day, retaining that information, and they go again. By ingesting the blue hive mind goop, Cage is brought into that little feedback loop, and he gets to retain that information as well, which means that he can slowly but surely make progress against these creatures. If you were to take these Mimics and plonk them into Star Trek or Guardians of the Galaxy, they just wouldn't work. The creatures would undermine whatever story that those movies would be trying to tell because they're not thematically appropriate. Without the full context that makes up The Edge of Tomorrow, Mimics just don't work. You couldn't put them in another movie without all of that context, and that's why you can't just drag and drop them into another sci-fi flick. They're pretty uniquely tied to this story specifically. If you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. I thought it was going to be more Tom Cruise action slop, but it turns out it's actually pretty dang good. If you want more of my thoughts on it, there's a video on the second channel over here, and I can have a bit of a ramble there. But otherwise, I hope you have a lovely day and don't run into some scary aliens. Peace.